author, columnist, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com, talk show host, and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello, you're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we are talking words of power, politics, and the state of New York City. It's going to be quite the show. Please remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by LibertyNation.com. You can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And you're here on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. I am, as always, your host, Mark Angelides, and we're joined by, once again, Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show that I know you know and love, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for being back with us, Tim.
Always a pleasure.
Now,
Always a pleasure, Mark. Let's have fun.
We'll try. We couldn't escape dragging you back in for this week, though, after some would call it momentous. Some would call it a great meeting. Some would say, sir, there's never been such a good meeting in the Oval Office between New York mayoral-elect Zoran Mamdani and the President of the United States, Mr. Donald J. Trump. And they had what I think was well, give me your thoughts on it, Tim. Now, you've written extensively on this as well on the pages of LibertyNation.com. But give me your thoughts on how you think that meeting went in the public vision.
Well, you could have knocked me over with a feather, Mark.
Right.
I'll tell you what, it was like being in an alternate reality, like you were viewing some surreal experience that was hard to even fathom. Because, of course, you know, as I wrote in LibertyNation.com on the day of the meeting in anticipation of it, grab the popcorn because there's going to be quite a spectacle, but there wasn't. And I think the media was very disappointed, too. And I think everybody on both sides of the aisle was sort of in a state of shock that these two men could find the kind of common ground that they evidently were able to discover. And what I wrote on after the weekend on LibertyNation.com, sort of looking back at that, is that what they do share is a populist worldview, that you respond to the particular concerns of the population at any particular time. And so on that basis, it made some sense. It also made sense that Mamdani knows that he's got to rely on Trump to keep the spigot open for federal funding, upon which Mamdani will be very dependent. And Trump really does love New York City. There's no question that's the place that launched him to global stardom and to become the most powerful man in the world, despite the protestations of his own hometown, to be sure. But I think they do share a common desire to make New York City work. And with that shared desire, some of the differences can be deconstructed. Obviously, they come from dramatically different polar opposite worldviews. However, it shows that in politics, unlike we've seen over most of the last dozen years or so, there can be some crossing of the aisle to get things done. And I think Trump sort of became an exemplar of that. So did Mamdani, and I think they were both drawn to each other's immense charm.
You know, I was actually not surprised that it went so well. I really wasn't. I know in hindsight, everybody's going to say, oh, of course, this is how it went.
I knew it.
Yeah, of course. But, you know, I have a track record of calling these things. But I wasn't that surprised because there's a media image of Donald Trump. And then there's the real Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has been wildly successful his whole life. He's up until he became the Republican nominee for president back in 2015, he was widely loved by just about everybody. And you don't do that with you don't get to that position without at least being moderately charming and being able to speak to people who do not necessarily share your point of view. I mean, that's how else do you build a business empire, right? And so I figured he would be the gracious host, as it were, because he's got the opportunity to present. Now, whether Zoran Mamdani wants this or not, and I'm almost certain he doesn't, Trump sort of presented as, I'm a mentor of Zoran Mamdani, even though they're on opposite sides, because, he's doing the bat packing. And we'll talk about this later, but when one of the reporters asked Zoran Mamdani, you called Donald Trump a fascist, do you stand by that? And Donald Trump turned around and said, you can just say yes, it's easy. It was showing two things. One, that Donald Trump loves a winner. He likes hanging out with winners, and Zoran Mamdani is a winner. No doubt about it. Yeah. And the other thing is, there's been this constant narrative for the last 10 years that Donald Trump is thin-skinned. Now, he's reactive. I've always agreed that he's reactive, but I've never felt he was thin-skinned, because you can't survive so long in politics and then reach the apogee of your thing 8 years down the line or 9 years down the line of your political career, and be thin-skinned, because you make too many enemies along the way. And yet he's rallied the party back around him. And, you've had Gretchen Whitmer walk through the doors there. You've had Bill Maher, who has made a career in the last decade of, he already had a career, of course, but of being notably anti-Trump, went for dinner with Donald Trump and apparently had a very nice time, and they got along quite nicely. And so I wasn't all that surprised. But how much do you think how much of what we are presented from the media and from congressional Democrats, how much of that is just the facade of what the real Donald Trump is?
Well, I think when Donald Trump said to Zoran Mamdani, just answer yes, it's fine. And he gave the kind of knowing smile that said, look, this is just politics. I understand it. I may not really think you're a commie. You may not really think I'm a fascist. Just go ahead and say yes. Give them what they want, because it's all just a show. But let's not forget that when Donald Trump was rising to stardom in New York, when he was rebuilding the New York skyline, he had to deal with a city that was 95% Democratic. So he learned a long time ago that you have to know how to deal with adversaries or those who believe things different than you do. And of course, it led many conservatives to be very skeptical of it, because he had proclaimed to be pro-choice, for example. He had said nice things about Clinton, Bill Clinton. He'd invited Hillary Clinton to his wedding and all this stuff. So he's used to crossing to the other side of a divide, so to speak. And I think he just called on that again. And I think he quite enjoyed confounding the media and his own party and the Democratic Party. I think the reaction from the left was very similar to the right. It was kind of like, here was a favorite uncle sitting there at the Resolute desk with his favorite nephew, Zoran, dutifully standing by his side and patting him from time to time and say, you're doing well, kid,
Yes, there was very much a lot of that. Now, you mentioned earlier about the populist bent that both men have, and we're going to discuss that after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Andrew back on Liberty Nation Radio, head coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I remain Mark Angelides. We're continuing our conversation with Tim Donner. Now, earlier in the show, Tim, we were discussing the meeting between Zoran Mamdani and President Trump in the Oval Office. And you touched on something that I really wanted to dig into. So let's not let that go. But both of these men, they have a very populist bent about them, don't they? And it's coming from different sides for what they perceive the populace to actually be wanting, and the remedies. Maybe I've got that wrong. Have I got that wrong, Tim? Maybe they both want the same thing. They just have different ways of achieving.
Yes, well, that used to be how politics was before Donald Trump, is that the two sides disagreed on the way to get where they both wanted to go, but they didn't call each other fascists or communists. They didn't, try to really undermine a presidency with false investigations and charges, which, of course, happened constantly through Donald Trump's first term. It is possible for people to agree on some things if they're assessing the problem.
Yes.
If they're assessing the problem, they can agree. And that brings to mind a great story that my wife, Lisa, the executive editor of LibertyNation.com, she and I would sit at a public gathering or an airport during the 2016 presidential campaign. And when somebody rebellious that looked like they were a rebel walked by, someone with, say, long hair and unconventional dress would pass by, we'd look at each other and go, what do you think? Trump or Bernie? Trump or Bernie? And the point was that you had rebels on both sides of the political aisle that were tired of the respective establishments of the Republican and Democratic parties. And thus, when Bernie Sanders was basically pushed out of the primary in 2016, many of his voters crossed over and then voted for Trump because they both identified the same problems. And likewise, it's reported, and I think reliably so, that at least 10% of the people who voted for Trump in New York City in 2024 told the lever for Mamdani in 2025. Yeah. And that's the nature of populism, is that it's not a fixed ideological belief system. It's really an accommodation to the stated and most desperate needs of the population, so that you become a lot more flexible than if you're a doctrinaire, conservative or liberal.
There's very much an element of pragmatism around populism, I think, that
sometimes they call it a transactional view of politics, like Donald Trump.
And I wonder about that transactional view under Zoran Mamdani in New York, because, as you pointed out earlier, the mayor-elect, he does need the federal spigot, especially as, even though New York State Governor Kathy Hochul has tacitly endorsed him, she has been quite clear that all of his plans, they're going to have to be either scaled back or ditched entirely, or put on a back burner until a later date, because what he's suggesting costs a lot of money. The many things he's suggesting all cost a lot of money, and other than just raising taxes and thereby scaring off your tax base, I mean, anybody who thinks the Laffer curve doesn't work in this day and age, they've got it. They need to examine something, either head or in economics. But
they still want to call it trickle down economics,
sure,
and which is a pejorative, of course. But the Laffer curve is, to me, almost indisputably correct in terms of where government revenues cross with, debt versus growth.
Yeah, you got to get the sweet spot, right? I mean, it's actually making. I follow a lot of the conservative right YouTubers and Twitter Xers. I don't know what you call that, posting their exhibits, maybe. And the Laffer curve is getting a resurgence among the people much younger than me. So people who maybe weren't even alive in 1984 when he came out.
It was even earlier than that, probably 81, 82. Yeah.
People who weren't even alive then. And they're talking about it, saying they've got to understand the Laffer curve. And I love seeing its resurgence. I completely forgotten what my point was here, Tim. But
you made another really alternative interesting point.
Yeah. So there's this this issue that was it, that Zoran Mamdani needs federal funds to keep things going while he continues to push for the revolutionary ideas. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing in terms of revolutionary, but the revolutionary ideas he has for New York City. He needs that money to continue, and he needs not to be in contention where the money might get held up in at the whim of the president or by an executive order that then has to get chased through courts, because he's on a finite timeline to be successful. Whereas Donald Trump's timeline in terms of political power and wielding the sort of federal funding, that's got a finite timeline too, but that's because he's term limited. He's done January 20th, 2029, Donald Trump's done. Whereas Mamdani might want to have a career that continues. I would certainly imagine he does, but he has to be proven successful in what he does. And court cases, stopping flowings of funds, that could all derail his promising career, right?
Well, I think if Mamdani is smart, what he should start pivoting towards is to say that his agenda is aspirational. In other words, he wants free buses. He wants heavily subsidized childcare. He wants to raise taxes on the rich. He wants to build new housing. He wants to freeze the rents. But if he's smart, what he'll do is say, look, a lot of this is dependent on the governor and to some degree the president, so that he puts Governor Hochul, in a position to be the one who can be blamed if Mamdani can't get done what he wants to get done. And there's tremendous pressure on Hochul to begin with, because she is being challenged by Elise Stefanik, who is considered a strong Republican candidate for governor going forward. We'll see what happens. But the general perception is that Stefanik is a strong candidate and that Hochul is not. Of course, she only became governor when Andrew Cuomo was forced to resign. And then she was able to barely win re-election against another impressive candidate, Lee Zeldin, back 3.5 years ago. So I think Mamdani would be smart to say, look, I can't do this all by myself. I need the governor and I need the president to be supporting my agenda in one way or another. In that way, he takes some of the heat off himself, some that he's already feeling. I mean, the World Socialist website was apoplectic about his meeting with Donald Trump. It said it was a grotesque spectacle to have Mamdani, a DSA, Democratic Socialists of America member, meeting with the fascist Trump. And the fascist was not in quotes. So, I think Trump, in addition to everything else, managed to drive a wedge between Mamdani and his most extreme beliefs.
We're going to discuss what power these words have in the current age, because my suspicion, Tim, is that they're losing whatever power they once had. And we'll be back after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. We're continuing our long-form conversation with longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, who also happens to be Liberty Nation's senior political analyst. Now, Tim, we've been discussing the populist leanings of both Donald Trump and Zoran Mamdani. We've discussed what they kind of have in common and where they differ. And I want to bring it back just now to when Donald Trump sort of laughed off a question to Zoran Mamdani in the Oval Office last week, and he was asked, you once called Donald Trump a fascist. Do you stand by that? And Donald Trump said, just say yes. It's easier than explaining anything. And then, of course, Mamdani went on later to say, yes, I do think he's a fascist. And I wonder, because Donald Trump didn't seem to care about being called a fascist, and it kind of makes me think that if you use something so much and attach so little value to it that you can just, as we say in England, toss it around willy-nilly to everybody who disagrees with your opinion, then it loses any power that it may have had to shock. So, for example, in England, Oswald Mosley in the 30s, he was the leader of the British Fascist Party, or Union of Fascists. And then so he was widely discredited. And then a couple of decades later, to be called a fascist was, it was almost a death sentence in British politics. Like, somebody's called me a fascist, and they've got to try and defend themselves against a fascist charge. But now it's kind of normal, right? It's kind of normal to be called a fascist, a racist, a Nazi by people who have differing opinions. And so I wonder if it's ammunition that's being spent, and where do people who would use such language without really giving it any thought at all, just as a word to attack or to demean somebody's argument, where do they go from here?
Well, I think you can start with the idea that, I would lay significant money on the wager that well over 50% of the American people have no idea what fascism is, though
I would not bet against you on that.
Though they know it's not good, right? They know it's a tremendous insult. But look, I'll go back to the old story about the boy who cried wolf, and he said multiple times he was warning, the wolf is here, and the wolf wasn't there. Then finally the wolf did appear, and when he yelled, "The wolf is here," nobody paid attention because he had too many false alarms about the wolf. And I think Trump realized that the way he sort of amusingly laughed and said, "Go ahead, you can say yes to the idea that I'm a fascist," because he realizes that it's just theatrical. It's performative politics to try and separate yourself from someone of a different belief system. But the Democrats have gone so far overboard for so long with this idea of fascism, despotism, authoritarianism.
This is the most important election of our lifetimes. There might not be in America, Tiv. There might not be in America left.
Well, I think this is why most people sort of look at it. The average person who doesn't obsess about politics and just wants to live their lives looks at this and goes, "Oh, all right, they're calling him a fascist again." I mean, rinse and repeat. They lose their power the more you use them, which is why when Trump said that Mamdani was a communist, well, that had a little more force because the word communist really hadn't been used all that much. Bernie Sanders came along as a self-described socialist, and Republicans were happy to bow to that label and continue to call him a socialist. Trump took it to another level with the communism thing, but I don't feel like the average person really responds to that kind of extreme rhetoric anymore because it's just been used too often and too inappropriately.
There's a couple of things there, Tim. First, and I have mentioned this speaking with you before on the show, that for me, when I look at, people call other people Nazis, and there's something really badly inherent in there, right? The Nazis murdered millions and millions of people for their ideological cause. And, so nobody would call themselves a Nazi nowadays unless they're willing to take that fire upon their heads. But the same has never been true. Well, in the last, 30 years, the same has never been true for those who self-identify as communist, even though there's clearly attributable far more deaths attributable to the communists than there were even to the Nazis. And I think it's either a failing of education or understanding that that's not a bigger thing. But then, of course, they're trying to switch it around and say, well, capitalism is a deadly force that leads to poverty, and this is why people are hungry. As if people weren't hungry before free markets came about. It's a blood libel in many ways, and I wonder, so where will these people who use this kind of language to just try and shut down debate? I mean, that's what they're doing now, right? They're just trying to shut down their opponents by putting a label on and hoping that the person who they put it against will react and then forget their point.
Those kind of names,
where do they go?
Those kind of names are designed to shut down conversation rather than ignite it. So you call someone a Nazi or a fascist, and there's no response to that other than, no, I'm not a fascist. And the person being called that isn't going to respond because they won't dignify the insult. And that's kind of what Trump was doing in the Oval Office, saying, go ahead, you can call me a fascist if you want. It doesn't bother me, because he's been called every name in the book.
Yeah, we hear often about how words have power and words should be used responsibly. And I think there's a lot of blame to go around in terms of the devaluation of language that has been. Now, we're going to be back with Tim Donner after this short break discussing what can make New York City great again. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Tim Donner. Now, Tim, I think the natural endpoint for our show here is to discuss what's really on everybody's mind, and that is, what will it take to make New York City great again? Now, it's certainly a great city as far as I'm concerned. Is it as great as it once was, though? Now, you're a New Yorker by geography and presumably by soul, Tim, although you are once removed now, I guess. So is New York as great as it used to be? And what are some of the problems that perhaps make it not quite the shining city on the hill that many thought it was?
Well, I think that the thing that New York has lacked for the longest time, with a few exceptions, such as Rudy Giuliani and Michael Bloomberg, has been subpar leadership, going all the way back to John Lindsay in 1969 and forward. The city
conservative liberal.
yes, liberal Republican. I mean, he defined the Rockefeller Republican moniker from back in those days. Those kind don't even exist anymore. But the lack of leadership from the bulk of the mayors over the last 50 years has been the biggest problem in terms of an ongoing problem.
Yeah.
But the biggest problem now that has to be reversed is New York's status as a sanctuary city. Now, for a long time, there wasn't a great cost to that. It was just virtue signaling. Oh, yes, we're compassionate here and we welcome all comers, whether they're legal or illegal immigrants. But they had to pay the piper for this. Once Governor Greg Abbott of Texas and Ron DeSantis of Florida said, okay, the Biden administration is letting in untold millions of illegal immigrants. We're not going to pay the price for this alone. We're going to send these illegal immigrants up north to these self-declared sanctuary cities. And it basically said, you want to call yourself a sanctuary city? Well, here you go. Deal with these millions of illegal immigrants who were allowed to come into the country. There's no question that Eric Adams, the current mayor for a few more weeks, New York had all these immigrants dumped on them, dumped on him and the city. And it's taken a tremendous toll in terms of crime, in terms of having to divert precious resources to keeping these people alive and fed. And yet, so many of them have gone out and committed crimes. They've overcrowded the city. I think if you reverse the sanctuary city status, that would go a long way towards allowing the city to correct its problems. Of course, there's not a chance in the world that Zoran Mamdani will renounce the sanctuary city status, but it also means he doesn't have to take it quite so literally. He's not going to have the problem that Eric Adams had, which is an overwhelming influx of tens or hundreds of thousands of new residents that have to be taken care of because none of them had jobs and they still had to eat and live and exist. And hopefully in a way that wasn't going to cause them to go out and commit crime because of the fact that they were impoverished, hungry, or whatever. So I think the sanctuary city thing is really the biggest single method. Reversing that would be the biggest single method of sort of flipping the switch in New York. But on a smaller scale, this is something that Andrew Cuomo and Curtis Lewa, the competitors of Mamdani during the mayoral election, they both wanted more cops, 5,000 more cops in the case of Andrew Cuomo. Now, Mamdani has not renounced it or said he will refuse to. He says he's happy with the 35,000 cops that they have now. But there's no question in a city riven by crime where people are afraid to ride the subway or go out at night. To have that extra police presence would make an enormous difference to make New York safe again.
You know, there's Mamdani's put up this proposal to have a literal army of social workers to go and deal with what's a mental health crisis call rather than a criminal call. You know, I spent actually some considerable time trying to think that through. We obviously we talk about a lot of things. Sometimes we don't think about the things too in depth, but I've really spent considerable time trying to play this out for different angles to see how this would work. And the idea that you can send a social worker to something that a dispatcher would have to determine, is this somebody having a mental health crisis, and is it likely to turn violent? A dispatcher, somebody who sits there and just fields the calls out. They'll have to choose, does it go this way, does it go that way? They'll be determining what kind of response ends up. And I would imagine that a significant proportion of the violent crimes that take place in New York City are mental health driven anyway. But that doesn't mean they don't require an actual police response. I mean, sure, you know, how are you going to convince the guy who's trying to set fire to somebody on the subway, hey, you know what? Maybe we sit down, we have a coffee, we talk about it, you know, while he's lighting somebody on fire. I mean,
look, I think that the theory behind Mamdani's plan makes sense in theory, which is if we can send social workers in to handle disputes that don't really threaten to turn violent, it will free up the cops to engage with serious crime. Sure. But the problem is that domestic violence, I've talked to a couple of cops about this, and what they say is that domestic violence, domestic disputes are the hardest to negotiate because tensions are so high. If a husband's beating his wife or vice versa, a social worker isn't going to be able to go in and convince the husband to suddenly turn his life around and stop beating his wife. I mean, you go and you say, when did you stop beating your wife? Okay, so the theory is not a bad one, which is that if you can channel real law enforcement to a crime that's considered serious, then you can use social workers for those crimes which aren't, or those disputes which aren't. But you put your finger on it. It's almost impossible to know simply from a 911 call whether a dispute is something that can be handled by a social worker or a cop. And in most cases, I'm assured a social worker is not equipped to handle any kind of domestic dispute because they don't want reason. They don't want rationality. They're hot under the collar and they need active intervention by a trained policeman.
Yeah, I think the outcome of this will be hurt social workers, or even worse. Which brings us to one other policy that I've given quite some thought to, and that's Zohran Mamdani's plan for the bus services in New York City to be free. Now, you can see why that would be a good thing for many low-income people who are trying to either trying to go to work and back home or looking for work where they got to crisscross the city. It's saving them, and it might not be much, but it adds up day after day, especially for low-income Americans. So you can kind of say, well, that would actually be a good helping hand. But the reality of the situation, I mean, who has to deal with the drug addicts who think, well, here's a nice, safe place for me to get high and sleep and perhaps even live. I can live on the bus for most of the day and even the night bus services and things, because they don't have to pay for a ticket. Now, is it bus drivers who are going to have to clear them out? And under what right will they clear them out when the city pays for bus travel? They're traveling by the virtue of being on there.
I think you're going to inevitably see the same thing happen to buses as it's already happening on the subways, which are not free. But if they're free, that says anybody can get on at any time and at least theoretically can stay on for as long as they want.
Sure.
Because it becomes a public right. And when you turn it from a commodity into a right, it's going to be a very slippery slope to try and deny people the length of time they want to stay on a bus. It's going to make them more unsafe because you're going to get people who are mentally ill and or homeless, and the crossover there is very high, who are, basically inhabiting buses, and that's going to drive people away from that kind of public transit and therefore make the whole free bus service counterproductive.
Yeah.
It will actually drive people away from buses rather than towards them because they won't be safe.
Yeah, that's pretty much the end result that I can't seem to escape. That no matter which way I try and think around the issue, is you end up with people who would rather be either on the street doing their drugs and sleeping and just enjoying whatever life they have there, or would they like to be, especially in winters, would they like to be on a nice warm bus moving from place to place with nobody there to usher them along, no major street violence taking place just aimed at them? Because, they are the homeless people and the drug addicts, that they are victims of a lot of street violence. I mean, they're also the perpetrators of a lot of street violence, but they're also the victims of it. And if they can just hang out on a bus, well, great for them, not so great for everybody else, right?
Well, you just ask yourself a question. Suppose you were addicted to drugs and homeless, and it's winter.
Yeah.
Where would you want to be? On the street?
Sign me up, Zohran Mamdani.
I mean, I think anybody would make that choice. And that's the problem with the motivation behind these free buses, is that they may be well-intended, but, unintended consequences of policies like that could be disastrous for New York and make it even more unsafe than it is now.
It's a fine line, and it's a tough one to walk for making New York City great again. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for being with us on the show today.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guest today, Mr. Tim Donner, longtime host of this here radio show. And, of course, you, the listeners, who take the time each week to tune in and hear what we have to say and join the discussion. You are appreciated. Please remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.